The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above the night shift corridor at Sacred Heart, each bulb casting that sterile white that made everything look like it was drowning in formaldehyde. Margaret Walsh had been walking these hallways for 8 months now, and the hum had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, something her body heard without her mind registering it anymore. She pushed the medication cart down the tile, her rubber-soled shoes making soft whispering sounds against the floor, and the antiseptic smell thick enough to coat her throat with every breath. It was 11:51 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night shift where the hospital felt like a sleeping animal, and Margaret moved through it like someone trained to leave no trace. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun so severe it looked like it might cause her physical pain, but it didn't. The style was practical, clinical, invisible. She had chosen every detail of her appearance to blend into beige walls, to become the kind of nurse people forgot 5 minutes after asking her name. 8 months ago, she had walked into Sacred Heart's HR office and handed over references from a temporary staffing agency in Virginia Beach that knew nothing about her real past, nothing about the woman who had once held entire teams together in places where the sky turned black with smoke and the ground beneath your feet wasn't solid anymore. The agency had verified her RN credentials. They had called her references. Nobody had asked the right questions. Margaret stepped into room 207 and began her systematic check, vital signs first, then for sights, then a careful documentation of everything in the electronic medical record with the kind of meticulous precision that made her handwriting look like it had been composed by a computer. BP 118/76. O2 sat 96. Heart rate 62, steady and strong. She noted the patient's pain level and adjusted the morphine drip by 0.5 milliliters per hour, movement so economical and practiced that anyone watching would have seen only the surface, a tired night nurse doing her job. They would not have noticed her fingers executing movements no civilian nursing program had ever taught, the way her hands moved through space as if they were following a map only her muscle memory could read. The patient in room 207 didn't even wake up. That was the point. Dr. Sterling had been watching her for 3 weeks. He stood at the nurse's station now, 11:52 p.m., with her shift report in his manicured hands, reading over her documentation with the intensity of someone studying a problem that needed solving. Sterling was the kind of doctor who wore monogrammed cufflinks and kept a photograph of himself shaking hands with the hospital's board chairman on his office wall. He was the kind of doctor who had discovered early in his medical career that phantom consultations billed to insurance companies could generate revenue streams that made actual doctoring seem like a quaint hobby. He had the kind of face that smiled easily in front of witnesses and went entirely still when he thought nobody was looking. What Sterling saw in Margaret's charting was threat. Not the kind you could point at and name. Something subtler. Her notes were too thorough. Her observations too acute. She documented things before other staff members even noticed them, a slight change in respiratory pattern, the way a patient's skin tone shifted under fluorescent light, the specific angle of a patient's body that suggested pain even when they weren't vocalizing it. She moved through the ER like someone who understood that minutes mattered, that details were the difference between a patient going home and a patient getting flagged for complications. She was the kind of nurse who might, in a moment of crisis, do something that drew attention. The wrong attention. The kind of attention that looked closely at billing patterns and consultant codes and the paper trail of unnecessary imaging referrals that had been generating $847,000 a year into Sterling's offshore accounts. Sterling had calculated, a liability. The break room was located at the end of the north corridor, a small square space with a microwave that smelled like burned popcorn and a refrigerator that nobody cleaned often enough. Margaret sat at the corner of the break table at 1:15 a.m. with her lunch, a turkey sandwich and black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and her hands wrapped around the mug even though the liquid temperature had dropped to something lukewarm and unpleasant. She had learned a long time ago that holding something gave your hand something to do besides shake, and sometimes the human mind could be tricked into believing that a cup of cold coffee was a reasonable explanation for why your fingers weren't quite steady. The break room door swung open. Nurses entered, 3 of them, respiratory therapy staff, maybe an orderly. Their voices created a bubble of sound and activity. When they saw Margaret, the bubble contracted. One of them grabbed a coffee pod. Another suddenly remembered something urgent in the unit supply room. The third sat down at the opposite end of the table, opened her phone, and scrolled through content she didn't appear to be reading. Nobody looked at Margaret directly. Nobody said hello. Nobody asked about her shift. This was how it started, not with violence or confrontation, but with the simple withdrawal of human attention. Like watching someone slowly become invisible. Margaret didn't look up from her cold coffee. She had learned not to. She had learned a lot of things in 8 months. She had learned how to order groceries online so she didn't have to navigate a checkout line where people might make eye contact. She had learned how to request the night shift specifically, not because it paid better but because fewer people were awake to wonder about her, to ask her questions, to notice the way she sometimes stared at a specific wall for too long or flinched when someone's radio made a sound that sounded too much like something else. She had learned how to file paperwork so perfectly that it became boring to read. She had learned how to be forgettable, how to move through the world like a ghost wearing scrubs and compression socks. The respiratory therapist who had suddenly remembered the urgent supply room need passed by her chair without making eye contact. The orderly continued scrolling. The third staff member, whose name was Rebecca, sat at the far end of the table with her elbows creating a wall of personal space. None of them had said anything. That was the particular cruelty of it. There was nothing specific she could point to, nothing that violated any hospital policy, nothing that could be reported or challenged. Just the simple biological reality that people instinctively avoid those they have been signaled to avoid. It was the way wolves dealt with injuries in the pack. It was the way humans had been doing it forever. Margaret didn't flinch. The trembling in her hand stayed where it belonged, invisible, contained, something she had learned to store in her chest where nobody could see it. She took a sip of the cold coffee and pulled out her phone, pretending to look at something that mattered. The break room hummed with the sound of people not talking to her. The microwave beeped in the corner. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor alarm chimed and then went silent. By 2:53 a.m., Sterling had made a phone call from his office. He sat behind an expensive desk with the photographs surrounding him like evidence of a life he had successfully cultivated, him with board members, him with physicians at conferences, him with his arm around the CEO at the hospital's annual gala. His hand held the phone to his ear with the casual confidence of someone who knew that certain calls were never refused. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar. They had worked together on several committees. They had, on multiple occasions, been beneficial to each other's interests. "I wanted to discuss something that's been concerning me," Sterling said, his voice carrying the careful concern of someone raising a genuine problem. "It's about one of our night shift nurses. Margaret Walsh. She's been here about 8 months, and I'm starting to see some patterns that worry me from a patient safety perspective." He paused, letting that land. Patient safety. The 3 words that made everyone listen. Nothing I can point to specifically yet, but her behavior seems increasingly erratic. She's overly focused on details that don't matter. She stays late, comes in early. It reads like someone who's not stable. I want to keep an eye on it, but I wanted to make sure you were aware. The voice on the other end made appropriate sounds of concern. Sterling hung up the phone and opened a desk drawer where he kept a private notebook, the kind with no electronic trail, no metadata, no digital fingerprints. He wrote Margaret's name at the top of a new page and underlined it. Below that, he wrote, "Possible instability. Monitor closely. Potential liability." He didn't know yet how he would use this. He only knew that people who noticed things, people who moved through their work with a kind of attention that suggested they understood systems and patterns, people like that could become problems if they ever decided to start asking the right questions. Better to establish a narrative now, while she was still just a forgettable night nurse nobody cared about. Better to make sure that when the moment came, and moments like that always came, everybody would already know that Margaret Walsh was someone unreliable. Someone unstable. Someone whose testimony wouldn't matter. The night shift continued. Machines beat their electronic rhythms. Patients slept or suffered in the darkness. The The fluorescent lights continued their endless hum like the sound of something mechanical breathing, and Margaret Walsh documented everything with the precision of someone for whom accuracy was the only form of resistance left. What happened next would change everything. But neither Margaret nor Sterling knew that yet. The disciplinary notice appeared on the unit board at 6:36 a.m., typed on official hospital letterhead, Margaret Walsh's name centered at the top in bold. Medication delays. 3 documented instances. Patient safety concerns. Dr. Sterling's signature in blue ink at the bottom, flourished and certain. The morning shift change crowded around it like flies to spilled coffee. Sarah Chen pulled it down to read closer, her badge clacking against the cork. Tom Morrison squinted at the dates. A per diem nurse Margaret had never spoken to whispered something to the charge nurse, whose jaw tightened. Within 4 minutes, everyone on the unit knew. Within 6, they were calculating which supervisor would handle her termination. Margaret saw them scatter when she clocked in at 7:15 a.m. She read the notice once, her eyes tracking each word with the same precision she used to read casualty reports 15 years ago in a field hospital outside Baghdad. Her hands were steady. Her breathing measured. One exhale through her nose, slow enough to count the rhythm. She unpinned the notice, folded it twice, and placed it in her locker without changing expression. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 9:32 a.m. in room 12. Dr. Sterling had been waiting for her. She could feel it in the way he positioned himself between her and the patient door, his chest out, his voice already pitched to carry. Mrs. Morrison sat rigid in the vinyl chair beside her husband's hospital bed, her hand gripping his like it might be the last time. Mr. Morrison had a cardiac history. He was on his 2nd day post-catheterization. He was terrified. And Sterling knew it. Nurse Walsh, Sterling said, his tone the temperature of a January parking lot. Not a question. A summons. Perhaps you can explain how a sterile field was contaminated during Mr. Morrison's dressing change this morning. Margaret stepped into the room. The door swung closed behind her with the pneumatic hiss of hydraulics. The field was sterile when I left it, Doctor, she said quietly. Her voice had a quality that made Mrs. Morrison look up, something in the flatness of it, the absence of defensiveness. I used sterile technique throughout. According to your notes, you turned your back on the field for 47 seconds. Sterling's voice rose, filling the small room the way a storm fills a valley. That's more than enough time for contamination. This is exactly the kind of careless nursing that kills patients. Exactly why we have protocols. He wasn't looking at Margaret when he said it. He was looking at Mrs. Morrison. Playing an audience of one. Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally. A single muscle contracted along the left side, barely visible. She turned to Mr. Morrison, whose face had gone the color of old newspaper. His monitor showed his heart rate climbing, 80, 85, 92 beats per minute. Fear was doing what the cardiac event couldn't. Sir, Margaret said, addressing the patient directly, your dressing is secure. The field was maintained to standard. You're safe. Sterling stepped between them. You don't get to reassure patients about your own negligence, nurse. The silence that followed was thick enough to operate in. Mrs. Morrison's hand was trembling. Mr. Morrison's monitor ticked upward. 96, 100. Margaret met Sterling's eyes without flinching. There was no anger in her face, that was what made it terrifying. Her expression was the blank, professional calm of someone reporting a weather forecast. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, and every word landed with the precision of a hammer strike. I have never compromised a patient's safety, and I never will. Sterling's face reddened. His mouth opened. Closed. He wasn't expecting response. He was expecting apology, or tears, or defensive stammering. He wasn't expecting her to say it like it was a statement of fact, like she was reading from a chart he'd already verified. He turned on his heel and walked out, letting the door close with enough force to rattle the medication cart in the hallway. Margaret stayed with Mr. Morrison for another 7 minutes, checking his foresight, ensuring his medication was running correctly, removing the fear from the room the way a nurse removes soiled linens. She didn't mention what had just happened. She let the steady competence of her hand speak instead. By the time she left, his heart rate had dropped to 78. His breathing was even. The panic was gone. The break room at 11:20 a.m. was a study in careful choreography. 6 nurses were eating lunch when Margaret pushed through the door, Sarah with her yogurt, Tom with yesterday's container of rice and beans, Janet and Michelle sharing a table by the window, 2 per diems on their phones. The room was full of the small sounds of ordinary life. Spoons clinking. Keys jingling. Someone's phone buzzing with a text. All of it stopped when Margaret walked in. Not paused. Not naturally faded. Stopped, like someone had cut the audio feed. Sarah's spoon was halfway to her mouth. She lowered it, closed the yogurt container, stood up. Oh, I just remembered I have charting in the system. Her chair scraped backward. She was gone before Margaret reached the refrigerator. Tom checked his phone as if he'd been shot. Code brown in 8. His typical excuse, the joke about the messy diaper patient. Except this time it wasn't a joke. He was genuinely looking for escape velocity. He left the rice and beans on the table, abandoned it like evidence. Janet and Michelle exchanged a look, the kind of look women perfect over years of social navigation. The kind that said without words, "Don't be seen with her." They gathered their things in synchronized silence and drifted toward the door, following Tom's wake. One of the per diems muttered something about taking the call outside. The other stood, stretched, and disappeared into the hallway. Margaret stood alone in a room full of evidence that she'd been there. Sarah's yogurt container on the counter. Tom's cold rice and beans. The lingering smell of someone else's lunch. And her, in the center of it, with a sandwich she'd made at 5:06 a.m. that morning, back when the only person she was avoiding was herself. She sat down at the table. Unwrapped the sandwich. Poured a cup of coffee from the break room pot that had been sitting since 7:48 a.m. The coffee was bitter and thin, nearly room temperature. She wrapped her hands around it anyway. Through the small window in the break room door, she could see them at the nurse's station. Sarah. Tom. Janet. Michelle. And there, in the center of them, was Sterling. His hand was on Sarah's shoulder. Not threatening, worse than that. Friendly. Conspiratorial. His head was bent close to hers, his mouth moving, words she couldn't hear but could read well enough in the way Sarah nodded, the way her eyes flicked toward the break room window, the way she quickly looked away. Margaret drank the cold coffee. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She didn't get up and leave. She sat exactly where she was, eating her sandwich, looking at nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold the same way everything else in her life had. But that wasn't the worst part. By 3:02 p.m., Sterling had made 4 phone calls. The first to the temp agency that had placed Margaret 6 months ago, where he spoke with a woman named Patricia who barely remembered the application. Just checking references, he'd said. Routine concern. Nothing concrete. Just some documentation issues I want to get ahead of. Patricia had hesitated, then given him the contact information for a job she'd worked before the temp placement, a private clinic in Virginia Beach that no longer existed. The second call was to the hospital's external investigator, a woman named Judith Chen from the state board, and here Sterling had been more creative. Patient safety concern, he'd said. Nothing I can prove yet, but the patterns are concerning. Medication timings that don't align with charting. One contaminated sterile field that compromised post-operative care. I'd like to have this reviewed before something worse happens. By the third call, to board member Patricia Henshaw, who owed Sterling favors from the imaging kickback scheme he'd been running for 18 months, the $30,000 per month in phantom billing that she'd never reported, the narrative had solidified into something nearly impossible to deny. I think we have a liability issue, he'd said. Nurse with questionable judgment. Recent performance issues. I'd like to move on this quietly. By 4:15 p.m., the investigation was already underway. Margaret was charting in the electronic system when the monitors in the trauma bay lit up like a pinball machine. Alarms cascading. Ventilator wheeze going irregular. The John Doe from 3 weeks ago, the Army Ranger medic who'd been visiting, assisting in trauma cases, teaching the younger doctors field medicine protocols, was coding. His monitor showed the rhythm first, tachycardia. Then the O2 monitor, saturation dropping like a stone. 88, 82. 78, the patient's chest was rigid, unresponsive to bagging. Margaret was there in 9 seconds. She didn't run. Running would have drawn attention. She walked with purpose, with the kind of calm that only came from having done this before, done it in places where running was the last thing you did because running meant panic and panic meant dead soldiers. Sterling was already barking orders. Get a chest tube. Size 32 French. ETA 2 minutes on the kit. Increase FiO2 to 100%. Push another round of epi. The problem was in those 2 minutes. The patient's saturation was 71% and dropping by the breath. Tension pneumothorax, Margaret could see it in the tracheal deviation, the jugular distension, the way the patient's chest wasn't moving even as the bag valve mask pumped air into his lungs. The air was going into his chest cavity, compressing his heart, collapsing his lungs. The patient had 90 seconds before cardiac arrest became inevitable. The Army Ranger medic, a man with tan lines and eyes that had seen the same places Margaret had, locked eyes with her across the bed. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition. Understanding. He stepped back. Gave her space. The movement was so subtle that Sterling didn't notice. But Margaret did. She moved to the bedside with a 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand. She knew the anatomy the way she knew her own heartbeat, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just above the third rib. She knew because she'd done this in a field hospital in Fallujah with a patient who was bleeding out and had no time for protocols or permissions. Sterling's voice rose. What are you doing? Step back. That's not your. She didn't hear him. Or rather, she heard him the way you hear ambient noise, wind, traffic, the inevitable complaints of the helpless. There was a hiss, a release of pressurized air escaping from the chest cavity. The patient's saturation jumped. 76, 80. 85, his color improved. His rigid chest softened slightly. The room went dead silent. The doors to Sacred Heart's trauma bay burst open at 11:51 p.m., and the paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man who had no name, no wallet, no identification of any kind. His left arm hung limp. His pupils were blown wide. His breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that told Margaret everything: hypovolemic shock, internal bleeding, and something worse pressing against his lungs. The jacket they'd cut away lay folded on the side table, and when Margaret reached for it to clear space, her fingers caught on something metallic pinned inside the lining. A combat badge. Bronze, weathered, with the unmistakable insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. She pinned it to the trauma board without comment and moved to the patient's side. Dr. Sterling arrived 3 minutes later, his face flushed from the cool room, his presence filling the bay like ozone before a storm. Margaret was already running the initial assessment, palpating the abdomen for rigidity, checking pupils, noting the mottled skin that screamed inadequate perfusion. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before under conditions far worse than a well-lit hospital room. 72 pulse. Respirations 18 and laboured. O2 sat dropping like a stone, beginning at 89, already falling to 84. A visiting Army Ranger medic stood in the corner of the bay, assisting with for access, and he had been watching Margaret work for 8 months without ever truly seeing her. But now, as she positioned herself beside the patient's left chest wall and her fingers found the landmarks with the certainty of muscle memory, he froze. She was executing a field-expedient chest seal, the kind of procedure that didn't exist in civilian nursing protocols, the kind that required you to have felt a sucking chest wound hiss under your hands while mortar rounds shook the ground. Her movements were too precise, too practiced, too knowing. The patient's monitor screamed. 142. Tachycardic and climbing. The oxygen sat continued its freefall, 81 now, 79, dropping through 76. Margaret glanced at the chest wall and saw what she already knew. The skin between the ribs was retracting inward with each breath, the intercostal spaces collapsing inward like a lung was folding in on itself. Tension pneumothorax. The air was building pressure inside the thoracic cavity, pushing the heart aside, crushing the blood vessels. In a hospital with full access to supplies, they would call for a chest tube, prep for immediate thoracostomy, clear the sterile field. But the patient's oxygen was already at 73 and falling, his blood pressure bottoming out at 84 systolic, and the right equipment was still in the supply room 2 corridors away. Sterling opened his mouth. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now." Margaret's voice dropped an octave, and it wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who had given orders under fire. The ranger medic's head snapped toward her. He knew that voice. He knew exactly what she was about to do. A nurse handed her the needle, and Margaret didn't hesitate. She moved to the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook landmark that civilians learned in ACLS certification but only learned to use in the field when the alternative was watching someone die in front of you. She felt the ribs, counted down, found the space. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like a held breath releasing. 73. 75. 78. The oxygen monitor climbed. 82. 84. The patient's chest softened. The rigidity that had locked his entire torso began to release, and his breathing became something approaching normal. 87. 89. His blood pressure began to climb back up, 92/58. Still critical, but moving in the right direction. The ranger medic exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Textbook field decompression. Sterling's face had drained of color, the redness draining from his neck and jaw, leaving him the shade of old paper. He stared at Margaret, and for a moment something flickered across his expression, recognition, confusion, and underneath it all, the first visible crack of fear. His mouth opened and closed. No words came. Margaret pressed a fresh dressing over the needle, taped it down, and continued her assessment as though nothing remarkable had occurred. BP climbing steadily now. Heart rate decreasing. The monitors settling into something approximating stability. She called out orders for blood type and cross, for a rapid for infuser, for the trauma surgeon to meet them in surgical prep. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser, each word precise and authoritative. The patient stabilized. Marginally, critically, but stabilized. Sterling excused himself with some murmur about checking records, and he was gone within 60 seconds. Margaret didn't watch him leave. She stayed focused on the patient's vitals, on the 4 fluids running in, on the subtle signs that told her whether this man would make it through the night. The ranger medic remained in the bay, and when she glanced at him, he was still watching her with an expression of absolute certainty, the look of someone who had just found a missing piece of equipment they didn't know the army had lost. By 1:15 a.m., the patient was in surgery, and Margaret was back in the main ER, charting vitals, restocking the trauma bay with fresh supplies. Her movements were precise and efficient. Her hands were steady. Nobody could have guessed that she had just revealed herself to someone with the clearance and the connections to verify what she was. At 1:48 a.m., Dr. Sterling sat behind his desk in his private office on the 3rd floor, and his hands were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. The door was locked. The lights were dimmed. And he was holding his personal phone to his ear, his voice a controlled whisper that carried all the fury of a man watching his leverage evaporate in a single moment. "I need you to move faster," he said. His voice carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Whatever you find in her background, whatever connects her to any kind of medical malpractice or instability, I need it documented by tomorrow morning. I don't care if you have to reach back 5 years. I don't care if you have to contact every facility she's ever worked at. A pause. He was listening to someone on the other end, someone whose hesitation he clearly found unacceptable. No, I'm telling you this is critical. She performed a procedure tonight that was completely outside her scope of practice. Completely. She went rogue during a code situation. That's liability. That's grounds for immediate termination and another pause, longer this time. No. No, do not contact her yet. We move on her suspension tomorrow at shift change. He hung up the phone and pulled Margaret's employment file from his cabinet. 8 months of work history. References from a community college instructor named Patterson who had taught a medical assistant certification course. No military service listed. No background before the temp agency picked her up through Staffing Solutions Now, a firm that primarily filled short-term positions, no questions asked, no deep vetting required. Sterling had hired Margaret Walsh through a temp agency because he needed someone anonymous. Someone with no connections to the hospital. Someone who would be easy to disappear if necessary. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. What he hadn't anticipated was that someone that invisible might be invisible because they had spent years learning how to be. At 4:15 p.m., Margaret received the suspension notice in an envelope handed to her by the HR coordinator before her evening shift began. She read it standing in the hallway outside the ER office: suspension pending investigation, alleged violation of scope of practice, immediate effective cessation of all duties until further notice from hospital administration. The words blurred slightly. She read them again. Still the same words. She had saved a man's life. She had performed the kind of emergency procedure that was performed thousands of times a year in military field hospitals, in combat zones where the alternative to acting was burying someone. She had done exactly what her training and her instincts had demanded, and it was going to cost her the only position she'd held in 8 years that didn't require her to lie about who she was. The parking lot at 4:41 p.m. was mostly empty. The evening shift was still an hour away from arriving. Margaret opened her locker and began removing her belongings methodically: a change of clothes, a coffee mug with a faded lighthouse, a photograph of her daughter Emma taken 3 years ago when she was still smiling without the wariness that had developed once Margaret's distance became too obvious to pretend wasn't intentional. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She placed each item carefully into the cardboard box that HR had provided, the same box they provided to everyone whose employment was being terminated. She was loading the box into her trunk at 5:02 p.m. when she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a single spot of the John Doe's blood on her left cuff, dark and drying at the edge of the fabric. She had washed her hands twice after the procedure. The blood must have transferred when she was moving between the trauma bay and the main ER. A detail. A small thing. The kind of thing that nobody else would notice. Margaret stared at it for a very long time. By 5:30 p.m., she was sitting in her car in the corner of the parking lot, engine off, the suspension letter laid across the steering wheel. Her hands had begun to tremble, not from fear, but from the violent compression of 15 years of restraint finally meeting a force it couldn't hold back. She pressed her palms against her eyes and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of the kind of shaking that she couldn't afford to do in public, couldn't afford to let anyone see. Couldn't afford to allow herself to feel, because feeling led to memory and memory led to Baghdad, and Baghdad was the reason she was sitting alone in a parking lot at 5:30 p.m. on a Thursday evening, having just lost the only refuge she'd managed to build from the wreckage of the person she used to be. Her phone remained silent. Her daughter would be waiting for her at 7 a.m. She had no idea what Margaret would tell her. The needle slid between her ribs with the precision of muscle memory. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers moved like they'd done this 1,000 times before, because they had, just not in a place with fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. The 14-gauge angiocath bit through skin and found the pocket of trapped air that was suffocating the patient from the inside out. The hiss of released pressure filled room 7 like a sigh of relief, and the oxygen saturation display shifted from 72% upward. 75, 78. 81, the patient's rigid chest began to relax. His airway opened. Color returned to his face. Margaret stepped back and let the trauma team move in, her hands already moving to strip off her gloves, her composure intact as stone. She didn't announce what she'd done. She didn't explain. She simply documented the time, the procedure, the vital sign cascade in the patient chart with handwriting as steady as a surgeon's. Around her, the nursing staff that had avoided her for 3 weeks suddenly couldn't look her in the eye, and not because they were ashamed, but because they finally understood that Margaret Walsh was someone entirely different than the woman they'd been treating. Dr. Sterling had been barking orders from the corner of room 7, calling for equipment that wouldn't arrive in time, his voice climbing in pitch the way voices do when authority is slipping. When the oxygen levels normalized, when the patient's color shifted from ash to pink, when the room stopped being a death scene and became a save, Sterling's face went white. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then the white drained away and red bloomed across his cheeks and neck like someone had opened a valve. His hands clenched at his sides. He understood, in that moment, what Margaret's needle decompression meant for his narrative. An unstable nurse didn't perform textbook emergency procedures in the middle of a crisis. An unstable nurse froze or panicked or called for help. An unstable nurse didn't move like that, like her hands had held lives together before, under conditions Sterling couldn't imagine. The investigation he'd already launched, the calls he'd already made to board members who owed him favors, the external investigator he'd already summoned, all of it just crumbled like cheap drywall. Within 60 minutes, Sterling was back on the phone. His voice had changed from the booming confidence of the ER director to something tighter, more controlled, a voice running calculations at brutal speed. He called board members at home. He called the temp agency that had placed Margaret, asking for background information, reference checks, anything that might paint her as unstable or dangerous or unprofessional. He contacted the external investigator directly, redirecting the focus not toward patient safety violations but toward scope of practice violations. A nurse performing a procedure reserved for physicians. A nurse who'd shown alarming signs of overstepping authority. A nurse who'd acted without physician authorization in a critical moment. Sterling was competent at sabotage. That was the terrifying part. He didn't rage. He didn't scream. He simply reframed the narrative. The needle decompression that had saved a man's life became emergency procedure performed outside scope of practice. The calm, decisive actions became concerning pattern of insubordination and boundary violations. The medical expertise that had kept a patient breathing became grounds for termination. He walked into the suspended nurse's break room where Margaret was finishing her charting and didn't acknowledge her at all. Instead, he spoke to the charge nurse within Margaret's earshot, his voice measured and professional. The board will need to review her credential file. We can't have nurses making independent procedural decisions in the trauma bay. Sets a dangerous precedent. Liability nightmare. His eyes flicked toward Margaret for exactly 1 second, just long enough to see if she'd react. She didn't. She simply closed her chart and stood, her movements unhurried, her face a blank slate. "You're suspended pending investigation," Sterling said, still not looking at her directly. "Effective immediately. Your access badge will be deactivated. There are protocols for a reason." He paused, waiting for something, a flinch, an apology, a tremor in her voice. Margaret picked up her pen and clicked the cap closed. Once. Deliberately. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "I understand," she said. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen, and knowing that paperwork and protocols were nothing compared to that. Sterling left the break room. His jaw was tight. He was making calls before he reached his office, his tone shifting into something more urgent now, more desperate. The board members he'd cultivated relationships with suddenly had their own concerns. One was asking about Margaret's background. Another was asking about the nature of the emergency. Sterling found himself explaining, then re-explaining, then trying to reframe the entire event into something that made sense within the context of his narrative. By 3:53 p.m., an official suspension notice was placed in Margaret's personnel file. By 4:48 p.m., she was walking out of Sacred Heart Hospital with a cardboard box containing her personal items, a change of scrubs, a pair of compression socks, a handwritten thank you card from a patient she'd helped 2 weeks earlier. The Norfolk afternoon was warm, the parking lot shimmering with heat, and when she reached her car, her hands finally began to shake. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the cardboard box on the passenger side, staring at nothing. 12 seconds passed. 20. The shaking stopped. She pulled the door closed, started the engine, and drove home because that's what you did when your life ended. You drove home and waited for someone to find you there and ask what happened. The Pentagon liaison's call would come in 3 hours. But Margaret didn't know that yet. She only knew that she'd saved a man's life and it was going to cost her the only refuge she'd found. The only place where nobody asked her name, nobody asked about her past, and nobody expected her to be anything other than just a nurse with steady hands and a willingness to work the night shift. She was wrong about all of that. But she didn't know yet. The suspension notice landed on Margaret's desk at 11:11 a.m., printed on Sacred Heart letterhead, signed by Dr. Sterling himself. Administrative leave pending investigation. Effective immediately. The words blurred as she read them a second time, then a third, her peripheral vision narrowing until all she could see was her own name typed in Times New Roman, 12-point font, official and final. She didn't protest. She didn't call the union representative or demand to speak with the administrator. She simply gathered the framed photo from her locker, Emma at 23, smiling in front of the Space Needle in Seattle, and the worn paperback copy of fried green tomatoes she kept wedged behind the extra bandages, and walked to her car through the morning light that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The parking lot was nearly empty. 3 hours had passed since she'd saved the John Doe's life, and in 3 hours, Sterling had convinced the board that she was unstable, unpredictable, a liability. He'd called risk management first, she learned this later, spinning a narrative about her performing procedures beyond her scope, expressing deep concern about patient safety, his voice carrying just enough worry to sound fatherly. Then he'd summoned the external investigator, providing the fabricated disciplinary file with its phantom medication delays and invented sterile field violations, documentation so thorough it seemed ironclad. The temp agency had already begun fielding calls from higher up the chain, voices asking questions about her background that made no sense to the agency director until the question came through official channels. Has Margaret Walsh ever served in the military? The question hung in the air like a depth charge, and suddenly her entire presence at Sacred Heart began to look deliberate, calculated, hidden. She drove through Norfolk without destination, past the naval base where she'd never set foot since leaving the service, past the corner grocery where she'd shopped for 14 years under the assumption that invisibility was survival. Rain had begun to fall, not hard but steady, tapping against the windshield in a rhythm that felt like Morse code. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling didn't come until she was home. The kitchen at 4:17 p.m. was too quiet. Late afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust particles that hung in the air like suspended time. Margaret sat at the small table where she and Emma ate dinner once a month, where they'd learned to talk carefully about nothing important, and she stared at the termination notice in her hands. The letter said she was terminated for gross negligence, for operating outside her licensure parameters, for endangering patient safety through unauthorized medical intervention. Every word was a lie structured around a single truth: she had done something only someone with military medical training could do, and that truth had exposed everything. The smell of antiseptic still clung to her scrubs. She hadn't changed. She'd simply stopped being a nurse the moment Sterling's suspicion had become a document, and that document had become institutional power. Muscle memory told her to shower, to remove the day, to leave the hospital behind, but her hands wouldn't move. She sat at the table holding the letter, watching the rain, and allowed herself to feel the specific gravity of losing the one refuge she'd built. Emma's key turned in the lock at 4:33 p.m. The shock registered first, her daughter stopping in the doorway, confusion blooming across her face as she registered that her mother was home, that Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table at an hour when she should have been administering medications or charting vital signs, that Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested tears, which meant the world had fundamentally broken in some way Emma couldn't immediately perceive. Emma was 28 now, worked in software development in Seattle, had driven down this morning for an unannounced visit because she missed her mother in a way that didn't require explanation. She set down her keys, her phone, her purse, and moved into the kitchen with the careful approach of someone entering a room that might collapse. "Mom." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Why are you home?" Margaret looked up. The fluorescent kitchen light cast shadows under her eyes that made her look older than 53, and for just a moment, Emma saw not her mother but a stranger, someone weathered, someone who carried weight the way old buildings carry their own architecture. Margaret slid the termination letter across the table without speaking. Emma read it once, twice, her jaw moving silently as she processed words that didn't make sense in any reasonable configuration of her mother's life. "What is this?" Emma's voice rose. "Gross negligence?" "Mom, you've been at Sacred Heart for 8 months without a single problem. You were their most reliable night shift nurse." "I was." Margaret's voice was steady, hollow out the way voices become when they've survived something too large to process. "Not anymore." "But why?" "The letter doesn't explain anything. It just says you performed procedures without authorization." "What does that even mean?" "You change floors and monitor vitals. You don't perform procedures." Emma's eyes were bright with something between fear and anger, the particular fury of a child discovering her parent was human and therefore vulnerable. "Did something happen? Did you make a mistake? Because this sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen, and there's no way they fire someone without documentation, without a hearing, without—" "Emma." Margaret's voice didn't raise. It simply became unavoidable, the way a riptide becomes unavoidable. "Sit down." Emma Saturday. The chair scraped against the tile floor, a sound like metal on bone, and Margaret watched her daughter's face cycle through confusion, fear, and something approaching anger, the anger of someone who realizes they don't actually know the person sitting across from them. "I can't explain this in a way that will make sense." Margaret's hands were folded on the table, and she was watching them as if they belonged to someone else. "I saved someone's life today. A patient who was dying. And the way I did it, the medical knowledge I used, it wasn't something a standard nursing program teaches. It wasn't something Sacred Heart was aware I knew." "But where did you learn it?" Emma leaned forward, understanding beginning to crystallize in her voice. "Mom, where did you actually—" She stopped. The question hung between them, enormous and unanswerable. Emma had never asked because Margaret had never volunteered, and somewhere in the calculus of their relationship, they'd agreed that some questions were too dangerous to ask. "You said you worked in healthcare. You said you were an emergency room tech before you got your nursing degree." Margaret didn't answer. She looked out the window at the rain, which was falling harder now, hammering the glass like something trying to get in or something trying to escape. "You've been lying to me." Emma's voice was small now, hurt settling into it like sediment. "This whole time. 8 months at Sacred Heart, 14 years in Norfolk, and you've been lying about who you actually are." "I've been protecting you." "From what?" Emma stood up, her chair scraping backward with violence. "From the truth. I'm an adult, Mom. I'm not a child. You didn't have to protect me from facts. You had to tell me." Emma's voice broke slightly. "My entire life, I've watched you flinch at helicopters. I've seen you wake up in the middle of the night. I've listened to you talk about Baghdad like it was some abstract concept you read about in a textbook. And you were, what? Military." Margaret met her daughter's eyes. The resemblance between them had never been more apparent, the same bone structure, the same fundamental competence in crisis, the same way of shutting down emotion in favor of information. Emma had always been stronger than Margaret had wanted her to be, less breakable, more resilient. It had seemed like a kindness not to tell her about the 15 years that had come before. "I was," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not anymore. But you're suspended from your job because of what you did during those 15 years. Emma's logic was running hot, rapid-firing through implications. Which means you chose to hide something so fundamental about who you are that your entire civilian life is built on the lie of it. The degree you got, the job you took, the person you pretended to be, all of it was designed so nobody would know that you were. Emma stopped, waiting for the word her mother wouldn't provide. Margaret simply looked at her, steady and composed, while rain hammered the windows and her daughter's carefully constructed understanding of her mother collapsed into something unrecognizable. I can't tell you. Margaret's voice was the color of iron. Not because I'm trying to hurt you, but because the life I built was specifically designed so that nobody would ever have to answer this question. You were supposed to be safe. You were supposed to grow up without any connection to the person I was. And what person is that? Emma's voice had become something dangerous, something that reminded Margaret of herself at that age, before Baghdad, before the things that break people into smaller versions of themselves. Who exactly am I supposed to believe I'm related to? Margaret had no answer. She simply sat at the kitchen table as the afternoon dissolved into evening, as rain became something heavier than just water falling from the sky, as the refuge she'd built, the anonymous life, the invisible nurse, the woman who belonged nowhere and therefore belonged everywhere, finally, inevitably, collapsed under the weight of what she'd done to save a stranger's life. Outside, sirens wailed across Norfolk, ambulances carrying other people's emergencies towards Sacred Heart, where Dr. Sterling was sitting in his office reading emails that had begun arriving just before Margaret's termination was finalized. The hospital administrator had called a meeting. Risk management wanted documentation. The external investigator had questions about the investigator's investigator. A Pentagon liaison had called asking about a specific needle decompression performed on a John Doe patient, and suddenly Sterling's entire house of cards had developed structural weaknesses that would take less than 24 hours to collapse completely. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She only knew that she'd saved someone, and in saving them, she'd lost everything she'd spent the last 14 years building. She only knew that her daughter was leaving, grabbing her keys, her phone, moving toward the door with the particular rigidity of someone trying not to cry. She only knew that the termination notice was still on the table, and that somewhere in the Navy's bureaucratic architecture, someone had just read the name Margaret Walsh and picked up a phone. Would you have saved him knowing it would cost you everything you'd spent 14 years building to protect? What would you do if the one person who you most wanted to keep safe was the one asking you to explain who you really are? If your past caught up with you when you were finally safe, would you run again, or would you finally stand and face it? Subscribe. Like. Comment. Let me know in the section below.